Good evening, everyone. A warm welcome to all. It's good to hear the chatter. You must be talking about some important things. That's good. My name is Carl Koop, and here at CMU I teach in the areas of history and theology. CMU is fortunate to be fortunate about all kinds of things. Fortunate to be located on territory stewarded for generations by the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, and Métis people. We benefit from treaty relationships every day, and we are committed to living purposefully as we seek to build meaningful, lasting relationships with Indigenous peoples and with all of God's creation. We are also privileged to host these John and Margaret Friesen lectures in Anabaptist Mennonite Studies. The lectures are co-sponsored by Canadian Mennonite University, the Mennonite Heritage Center, and the Center for Mennonite Brethren Studies. We welcome Dr. Astrid von Schlachta from Weierhof, Germany. She is head or the director of the Mennonite Research Center there. She lectures at the University of Regensburg, and she is also involved at the Peace Institute at the University of Hamburg. As a historian, she has published widely, and she is also involved in work associated with the board of the Associated Mennonite Churches in Germany. 3 of her books have been translated into English: From the Tyrol to North America, The Hutterite Story Through the Centuries, published by Pandora Press; Holding Fast to What is Good, Tradition and Renewal in Hutterite History, published by Hutterite Brethren Book Center in 2020. And lastly, the book that's in the back on display, Anabaptists from the Reformation to the 21st Century, also published by Pandora Press in 2024. Dr. von Schlachta's overall theme for these lectures is the Anabaptist Peace Witness, Historical Significance, and Today's Mission. This morning's lecture had to do with the Anabaptists and the Peasants' War. This evening's lecture looks at Mennonites and military service. We look very much forward to your presentation, Astrid. Thank you for being here with us.
Thanks for the introduction. Again, thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure already this morning, and I'm looking forward now to this evening. And maybe you could just start the first slide, and then we are quite good until the presenter is here. So, for what is war but a sea of misery and a desert filled with all kinds of horrors? In order to give this sad evil the appearance of good, it is presented as right and innocent. But who wants to believe that someone can become happy through the misfortune of another? Said Angel Arisen van Dordrecht, the preacher of the Anabaptist congregation De Rijp in the Netherlands in 1693. It was a path that Anabaptist congregations navigated from the 16th century to writing of this statement, because that Anabaptists thought about the evil of war, its harm to society, and the horror and suffering inflicted on the human population in war. This was not yet the case in the 16th century. Anabaptist statements on nonviolence in the 16th century were mainly So Anabaptist statements on nonviolence in the 16th century were mainly characterized by discussing the use of the ministry of the sword. We heard about this at the end of the first lecture in connection with Balthasar Hubmeier. The question that was raised and discussed was whether the authorities had the right to maintain order and whether Anabaptists were allowed to participate. The articles of the Schleitheim Confession of 1527 stated, and let's see if that works now, perfect. The sword is an order of God outside the perfection of Christ. The author, Michael Sattler, followed up. The secular authorities were appointed to use the sword. In the perfection of Christ, on the other hand, solely, he said, that's a quotation, solely the ban is used to admonish and exclude those who have sinned. End of the quotation. Pointing to a clear separation of the two kingdoms, a consistent separation of church and state. The authors of the Schleitheim Confession and many early Anabaptists adhered firmly to these beliefs, that a Christian must not take up a sword or other weapons, no matter for what purpose, that the authorities will never be able to fulfill Christian norms, and that a Christian can therefore not be part of the authorities. These principles show that non-violence resulted in a withdrawal from society and separation. Without this, going out from them, referring to the 16th century society, it was not possible to lead a life of non-violence. These were premises under which it was not possible for Anabaptists to make a positive contribution to society for a long time. What remained for them was retreat and separation. From here now, we start our journey into the later centuries. There are many diverse questions that pertain to the topic of non-violence. So we continue to follow the not straightforward but winding path. We will now see 500 years of Anabaptist Mennonite nonviolence is the path with ruptures, failures, and ambivalences. In the following lecture, I would like to trace with you the path of Anabaptist Mennonite nonviolence in the early modern period. And I will do this with the help of 4 highlights. First, expectations. When Anabaptist life suddenly becomes possible. In the 17th century, with the increasing spread of Enlightenment ideas, gradually the view gained acceptance among the political authorities. Anabaptists can be tolerated without endangering the societal order. In order to offer, quotation, deviant groups and subjects a place in their territories, the sovereigns resorted to a means offered by imperial law, known as privileges, a legal instrument with which certain groups of subjects could be granted special rights. In the specific case of the Anabaptists, it served to grant them tolerance with exemptions, and thus enabling them to find a place in the early modern society while preserving their confessional principles. Examples of Anabaptist settlements with privileges are Friedrichstadt an der Eider, Hamburg, Neuwied, Mannheim, and several more. To be granted privileges, this meant in the Anabaptist case to have permission not to have to take up arms, not having to swear an oath. However, it was quite common for Anabaptists to have to pay compensation for this exemption or provide alternative service. For example, in Hamburg, Mennonites received permission from the Danish king, because Altona was Danish at the time. They received permission from the Danish king to be exempt from military service in 1601 and then again in 1686. But when the town would be attacked, the Mennonites had to aid in extinguishing fires on a tower of the city wall. Or in other regions, for example, East Frisia and the Palatinate, Mennonites had to pay a certain amount of money to be exempted from military service. In Prussia, this payment became compulsory in 1773. As is well known, the Mennonite money was used to finance the military academy in Kulm. So something like a form of dark humor of the authorities at that time. In some regions, Mennonites were allowed to be exempted from military service if they provided a replacement. That meant a Mennonite did not do any military service, but he paid another man to do it for him. This caused quite some debate among the Mennonites in the early 19th century. Can we reconcile it with our conscience that we pay others to fight and possibly die for us? The Hessian Mennonite Christian Unziger addressed this in the Mennonitische Blätter in 1867. And he answered the question in the affirmative, arguing, "I only pay the man who stands up for me for something he would do anyway. I give him something from my funds so that he can improve his situation and probably also put something aside for later days." Thus Christian Unziger. Living under the protection of privileges of territorial rulers offered Anabaptist communities protection and shelter for almost 2 centuries. Even if this form of toleration was always a matter of grace, dependent on the respective ruler, nevertheless, it was alive in a certain security. Oops, that was already once. Okay. In 1769, the Mennonite Lorenz Friedenreich from Neuwied writes in a letter to his West Prussian brother in faith, Hans van Steen, and that's the quotation you have to see now. "We stay here under the protection and gracious help of God, both in non-resistance as well as not swearing oath and practicing adult baptism. We also have our public worship and religious exercises in which we have not yet been disturbed." So that's the situation of toleration. And this toleration went hand in hand with a conviction that gradually prevailed. If it was the conviction that the Mennonites were the least dangerous of the known religious sects. You saw this quotation already this morning. So the conviction that the Mennonites were the least dangerous of the known religious sects because their conscience did not allow them to bear arms or, quotation, rebel against their legitimate authorities. That was a quotation from an author from the journal Staatsanzeigen in the late 18th century. Toleration by privilege also meant, for about 2 centuries, the debate about whether or not taking up arms was permissible for an Anabaptist conscience, was largely obsolete. There was no need to discuss it because privileges represented and respected Anabaptist beliefs. So a second highlight. War, atrocities, thinking for society. From the 17th century onwards, the political theory and the practical policy of rulers found more and more positive answers to the toleration of dissenters. Anabaptists were tolerated, that is the one side. The other side of the medal was that the Anabaptists were also working to improve their image. The fear of contact with the world is diminishing on the Anabaptist side. Separation is reduced. I refer you to the statements made by Tieleman van Sittard in 1664, quoted today in the midday lecture. "We are not Anabaptists, but Mennonites. And as Mennonites, we belong to Protestantism and have nothing to do with Münster or Münster. We are open to society." And suddenly, it was no longer a no-go for Mennonites to take office as part of the authorities. Under the impression of growing integration into society, the willingness to assimilate is now also growing. This brings about a new thinking among Mennonites. For in thinking about society and the attempt to make positive contributions to society based on Anabaptist beliefs, being a positive influence. It also means to think about what war means for society. This gives rise to reflections on nonviolence that embrace a much more cosmopolitan and worldly-minded perspective. Nonviolence is now seen as a premise for Christian society, which no longer thought of solely in Anabaptist terms, but in Christian terms. From the late 17th century on, the first Mennonite writings on nonviolence appear, which discuss the effects of war on people's moral and physic. It is a process of reflection reminiscent of the morally responsible nonviolence of an Erasmus of Rotterdam, as he discussed it in his work, The Lamentation of Peace, die Klage des Friedens. In it, Erasmus warns the princes urgently against waging war against each other, not to take up arms as Christians against other Christians. I have already introduced you at the beginning of this lecture to a Mennonite preacher who takes up such ideas, Engel Arison von Dordrecht, preacher of the Anabaptist congregation De Rijp, north of Amsterdam. Lines quoted at the beginning are from a letter that von Dordrecht sent to Friedrich von Spanheim, professor of theology at the University of Leiden. The Anabaptist preacher published his epistle in 1693. It is a fierce criticism of Spanheim. For in the 1640s, the latter, Spanheim, had been involved in the debate about the toleration or expulsion of the Swiss Anabaptists. You see here from the Martyr's Mirror a picture of the persecution of the Swiss Anabaptists. As is well known, the Swiss Anabaptists experienced very hard times in the 16th century. Persecution, expulsion. The settlement of the Mennonites in the Palatinate was a consequence of this harsh persecution in Switzerland. A decisive argument against the Anabaptists had come from Swiss authorities. It said, Switzerland needs subjects who defend the fatherland. The Anabaptists do not do this, and this is why they should not be tolerated in the country. From 1710, the following statement by the Swiss envoy to Holland, François Louis Pesme, has been handed down. The context of the statement is the deportation of the Bernese Anabaptists in 1710. And it's said, the possibility of a defense of our states rests only in the sovereign's competence to call the subject to arms as often as it is necessary. The Anabaptist principle of not wanting to bear arms would lead to the destruction, quotation, to the destruction of the country's ability to defend itself. Therefore, the Anabaptist should leave the country. Now, the professor Friedrich von Spanheim now had repeated all the arguments that emphasized the danger of the Anabaptists and linked them to their non-violence. Among other things, he had taken up the popular defamation of the Anabaptists that they were the descendants of the Münsterites. And thus, Engel Arison van Dordrecht responded, and he protested against this defamation. Against this defamation of the Anabaptists, and he also addressed the issue of nonviolence in this context. He clearly condemns war, even just war. And he writes, some of the holy fathers of our religion have quite rightly declared that even a just war should be clearly hated. especially by Christians who have learned from our meek Savior to spare the blood of other people. And among all kinds of wars, the one that is most to be rejected and cursed is the one that is waged among such people, the Christians. And he goes on to state, how should we then fall into decay in our souls that for the sake of our vain body we not only do not want to suffer injustice, but also do injustice into the most innocent? For although justice is felt in war because sometimes the wrongdoer is punished, as an example to others, but one is mistaken. For if one punishes those at the same time, the innocent will have to suffer the most grievous and miserable things, and very unjustly. For who has ever been also to bind the savage war to the straight poles of justice and equity? That is why a just war is also street robbery, because the aim to oppress innocent fellow countrymen and the like. Dorrest bases his answer not only on the relevant biblical statements from the forging of swords into plowshares and Jesus' instruction to Peter to put the sword back into the sheath, but he also quotes numerous scholars, church fathers, and so on. Dorrest's missive is an appeal to realize what war actually is. He states that war is often not used to protect people, but as a means of stealing money and property, and to permit various acts of willfulness. As a means of conflict resolution, a war is highly unsuitable. A third highlight, Mennonites and weapons, when war suddenly puts money into the till. As early as the 17th century, Mennonites recognized that war opened up a wide range of opportunities to earn money. First, there were the entrepreneurs who make a profit in war. Very close to the Mennokate, near Wüstenfelde, close to Bad Oldesloe, the place where Menno Simons lived and spent his last years, there's a small river called Pulverbeek. This little river takes its name from the powder mills that used to lie on its banks, gunpowder mills. Well, it is known that one of these mills was run by Mennonites, namely from the Rosen family. Later, well-known pastors of the Hamburg Mennonite congregation emerged from this family. Probably as early as 1543, when Anabaptist refugees came to Wüstenfelde together with Menno Simons, there was Kurt Rosen among them. And this Kurt Rosen, he set up a gunpowder factory near Wüstenfelde. And there were other gunpowder mills operated by Mennonites. Gerrit Rosen, a preacher in the Hamburg Mennonite congregation in the 18th century, writes, his father, Kurt Rosen II, had produced fine pulver, or buskrit, that is a powder of the best possible quality, suitable for precision weapons, it says. During the 30 Years' War, in the middle of the 17th century, Kurt Rosen II owned 3 mills in southeastern Holstein near Ratzeburg, where he produced gunpowder. And he said, should the oppressive war years have been an advantage for Kurt's business? He asked. That was Bernd Karl Rosen who asked that in his history of our house. So from gunpowder mills to cannons on merchant ships. Weapons on merchant ships. From the 17th century onwards, there were discussions among the Anabaptists in the Netherlands as to whether Mennonite merchants and ship owners were allowed to arm their ships, to be safe against pirates and to be safe in times of war. The historian Simon Friedrich Rues who in 1743 published his book Aufrichtige Nachrichten von dem gegenwärtigen Zustand der Mennonisten oder Taufgesinnten. You see the title cover there. Simon Friedrich Ruiz discusses in this book the debates that were there among the Mennonites and the impact of these debates. And he writes, some Anabaptists would no longer be afraid to transport their goods on unarmed ships, would no longer be afraid to transport their goods on unarmed ships, but were able or were open to arm their ships and to carry guns when traveling. According to Ruiz, this new openness to arm ships was also responsible for the emergence of new names. Anabaptists who no longer rejected canons on the merchant ships would now call themselves wracklose Christians, that is, revengeless or revenge-free Christians. So we are back to names here again. Ruiz points out that it was the Friesen and the Waterlanders, so two more liberal branches of the Anabaptists, who would have opted for this name change in the early 18th century, because they wanted to express their nuanced view of non-violence. Wracklose Christians, this should express the following in terms of content. The wracklose Christians were convinced that it should not be allowed to exercise, quotation, revenge and violence in order to attack others, but non-violence should not be practiced at any price. To fight, quotation, unjust violence with counter-violence, this was no longer rejected by the wracklose Christians. So they ultimately accepted what had been known since Augustine as just war and what we heard in the quotations before. However, they would reject violent attacks, which is why none of them could be a soldier. Well, this also changed. A third highlight, that's young men in uniform. In the early modern period, military service offered the opportunity to earn money, and Mennonites saw it that way too. In 1665, for example, the Dopsgesinnte Ide Claes and Gilles Cornelis went to war against England. They needed the money, they said. Poverty drove Mennonites into army. Claes and Cornelis are not the only examples of poor Mennonites who saw good earning opportunities in military service. A quick buck, cheap money to earn a living, at the expense of denominational convictions. A sign for social inequality in Anabaptist churches, which led to different models of life and different answers to questions of faith. Young men in uniform, not only as a must to earn money, but also to express social status. And the social status of Mennonites improved more and more. Young men from Mennonite congregations wore uniforms because they expressed their affiliation with the bourgeoisie in the cities. It is recorded, for example, that young people from the Neuwied congregation dressed in military garb and carried a sword to ride towards the young prince and welcome him, a special tribute to the young prince and to greet the prince. In Krefeld, too, attitudes towards carrying arms changed in the 18th century. The sources tell us that, and this does not show the Mennonites in Krefeld in uniform, but just a depiction with Frederick II, and that shows how high class the Mennonites were at that time. So the sources tell us that Mennonites were part of the Guard of Honor that in 1763 greeted the sister of Frederick II, Anna Amalie, in Krefeld, armed and in uniform. And in 1793, the Mennonite Gottschalk Floh appears in the sources as the officer in charge of the Krefeld Civil Guard. All this demonstrates the growing integration of the emerging Mennonite bourgeoisie and industrial class into the general society that surrounded them. A fourth and last highlight. Through the ages, nationalism, national socialism. The reservation towards the military diminished again in Germany in the 19th century. Whereas the 19th century in general was a time of great changes. The Mennonites were fundamentally affected by this. What had happened? The new ideas of human rights and thus of equal civil rights in society went along with the requirement that there could no longer be any exception to civic duties. Who enjoys civil rights has to take civil duties. That meant there can be no privileges anymore for anyone. This concerned Mennonites the most in their principle of nonviolence. For to be privileged to not take arms was no longer possible under these conditions. All those who did want to keep alive in nonviolence now had to go seek greener pastures elsewhere. Most of them therefore made the journey across the pond, as did the early this morning mentioned John Horch. But they were a minority. Most of the Mennonites in Germany had already found their place in civic and bourgeoisie society and willingly wore the uniform for social prestige and fought as soldiers in the various wars. Ulrich Krebil from Weierhof, he was member of the French troops and wrote letters home with these wonderful paintings. But until the late 1860s, Mennonites still fought for exemptions, though in the end they were only successful in getting permission to serve in non-fighting units of the army, serving in roles for maintenance and health care, which was laid down then in the Supreme Cabinet Decree in 1868. For the whole 19th century, the discussions among the Mennonites on how to deal with nonviolence persisted. On the one hand, there were proponents of the growing integration of state and nation. For example, Leonhard Weidmann, Mennonite preacher in the congregation in Monsheim in the Palatinate. He brought a very interesting argument into public that dates from 1819. He went back to the writings of Manus Simons and distinguished between regulations of a religious nature and regulations of a civil nature. The former included baptism of faith. The latter, Weidmann interprets as follows. In addition, there are three other regulations from him, Manus Simons, to which his followers had to commit themselves, but which are not of a purely religious nature. They affect civil life, which is the reason why the Mennonites more and more divided from them, namely the prohibition of bearing arms, the exclusion from civic offices, and the abstention from taking oath. Only the latter is still in force everywhere. As far as the first two are concerned, it has been recognized that they can no longer be enforced in the old strictness. A second political development had an impact on Mennonite discussions. In the course of the 19th century, nationalism became more and more aggressive and exclusive. Mennonites started to include themselves more and more in the evolving German nation. All questions concerning military service and denominational peculiarities now were subordinated to the highest commandment of the nation, the love of the fatherland and the protection of the same. Let's try to follow the reasoning of the time. In 1872, the Mennonite preacher Jakob Mannhardt published an article in the journal Mennonitische Blätter. The title of his article was "Can and Should Mennonites Comply with the Compulsory Military Service Demanded by the State?" His argument was based on Mennonites are members of the political community here on earth. Mennonites enjoy the benefits and protection of the state, so Mennonites also have duties and share the burden with others. For a long time, according to Mannhardt, Mennonites had not thought about nonviolence, but had led a quiet and peaceful life in subordination to the state on the soft cushion of the privileges. Mennonites would have tacitly accepted this without giving any further thought to the question of nonviolence. But now the issue of nonviolence arises again. For Mannhardt, the fundamental question was, what is the idea behind compulsory military service? And he replies, we believe the idea rooted in Christianity of the individual giving his own personality to the state for the good and best of the whole and in the service of the same with life and limb. It is not enough for the individual to prove himself a quiet citizen and subject, to pay tax and to give honor to whom honor is due. He should also recognize himself as obliged to take a personal part in the protection and safeguarding of the state family, so Staatsfamilie is mentioned here, and in the defense against all that can harm its property and welfare. In order to guarantee this order, there is military service and also compulsory military service. The quotation that all male citizens currently qualified for such service can be called to that service is an quotation, act of justice against the whole. Furthermore, love for and protection of the fatherland must be the top priority. Mannhardt is also convinced that separation is no option and not appropriate at all. He argues that the notion of a separation that also involves to live outside the world was not a Christian notion at all. It says, he says, serve one another. Serve one another. Despite all affirmative attitudes, there were also other dissenting voices. We already met one of them at the beginning of the lecture this morning, John Horsch. Another voice was the elder of the Olofferfelder congregation, Peter Friesen. In 1850, he publishes a very clear plea for non-resistance. Friesen's argument is military power is needed to maintain order and peace. But he sees this as incompatible with the doctrine of non-violence. And so he criticizes those Mennonite contemporaries who were prepared to do military service for the, quotation, full enjoyment of civil liberties, as we heard it with Mannhardt. However, Friesen is extremely cautious about the impact of the peace testimony on society. According to the Olofferfelder elder, he does not expect, quotation, all people to become defenseless. Peace on earth, he is convinced, can only be achieved anyway if you let God rule and do not seek your, quotation, true happiness in human constitutions and forms of government. So that should have come, but we have next one. The petition of the Baden Mennonites aimed at a similar direction. This petition of the Baden Mennonites was sent to the Paulskirche Parliament in 1848 by the elders of the congregations in Baden. With reference to the fundamental rights of the German people, the Baden Mennonites demand freedom of conscience in matters of faith. And they asked to be allowed to continue paying a tax instead of military service. An exemption for Mennonites from military service would, it was believed, hardly affect the, quotation, armed might of the fatherland. Well, the petition was not successful. And this is not the end of the story of the Mennonites' rethinking of nonviolence. When the Association of German Mennonite Churches, one of the umbrella organizations in Germany, gave itself a constitution in 1934, so we are now in 1934, non-resistance no longer played a role at all. Only the refusal to take an oath is mentioned as the basis of all morality. And military service is left to the conscience of each believer. There have been critical voices about this constitution and the statement that military service is left to the conscience of each believer. But these critical voices did not come to the public because this constitution did not focus enough on nonviolence, but because the constitution did not throw it explicitly enough into the dustbin of history. Dirk Kattepol, for example, a preacher in Krefeld, in a 1934 Mennonitische Blätter article, criticized the wording in the Constitution of 1934 of the Association of German Mennonite Churches, which would aim far too much at a compromise. One of the most important moral and religious questions, says Kattepol, with regard to dealing with nonviolence, is left to the individual conscience to decide. And then the association should have spoken out much more clearly in favor of military service. He guesses they probably thought they had found a compromise that would not offend anyone. You said, he says that the quotation, you said neither yes nor no, hoped to please everyone and therefore pleased no one. As Christians and Mennonites, he says, we must bear arms, not because an evil authority forces us to do so, or because there is unfortunately not much we can do about it for lack of courage or for the sake of peace, but because we as Christians that affirm this world, love our people, serve it, and want to stand up for its continued existence and happy development, even with our lives. And he quotes Adolf Hitler, heroic virtues are the preserving power of our people, says Adolf Hitler. The same formulations could be heard from other voices. For example, Erich Göttner, another Mennonite of that time in Germany, he said in 1937, Mennonites in Germany are not advocates of non-resistance. And as widely is known, German Mennonites fought in the Second World War. So let me conclude. It is an often told narrative Anabaptist story that the Anabaptists were united and unanimous in their position of non-violence. They are called the pacifists of the Reformation era. But within the spectrum of Anabaptist beliefs, there were different ideas on how to deal with the power of the sword. And the differing degrees of nonconformity and separation often clashed. There was never one answer to the question of nonviolence, not in the 16th century and not later. We are therefore confronted with ruptures and ambivalences in the narrative of the Anabaptist peace testimony. Looking at violence must, of course, raise questions about the various forms of violence, also in Anabaptist history. So, what about structural violence? Wasn't and isn't church discipline also a form of violence? What about violence expressed verbally in the Anabaptist tradition? What about polemics? Mutual polemic condemnation was often part of the Anabaptist history. Anabaptists repeatedly denied each other the justification of faith. They even denigrated each other. Divisions in the congregations show the fault lines and the condemnation of the others very clearly. And what about physical violence, domestic violence, physical altercations? A look at later Anabaptist congregations shows that it is an illusion to think Anabaptists were above such behavior. And we can assume, despite the lack of still missing in-depth studies, that this also applies to the 16th century. If we place the Anabaptist convictions concerning the question of violence in the 16th century in a societal context, we can conclude, on the one hand, there was the pragmatism of Balthasar Hubmaier. On the other hand, a strict peace testimony meant radical nonconformity, and that invited expulsion, prison, and even the death penalty. A life of non-violence could not be lived in the contemporary society of the 16th century. Instead, non-violence meant separation, a going out from them, according to 2 Corinthians 6, meaning that believers had to withdraw from society. Because society, including its politicians and scholars, could not integrate Anabaptist nonconformity, but rather defamed, stigmatized, and criminalized the Anabaptist. The challenge posed by Anabaptist nonviolence was not accepted. The request to larger society to question widespread norms was answered negatively. The situation changed from the 17th century on. The Anabaptists and the authorities increasingly became fellow countrymen and citizens. In Anabaptist congregations, the developments described above led to an ever-increasing emancipation of the Mennonites. This increased interest in broader society as well. And it brought interesting reflections on the social relevance of Anabaptist beliefs. Anabaptist peace witness was no longer something that could only be lived in separation, but the focus was much more on making a positive contribution to the whole of society. Anabaptism was thus thought to be socially relevant and influential in society. Witness to peace, this was not something for a separated congregation, but was intended to reach into society itself. In the momentous year of 1848, the West Prussian Mennonite preacher Karl Harder postulated, the peace that Christ gives his fellow followers must have an impact on society. And he says, quotation, as soon as peace and freedom dwell in the hearts, a general peace of nations must also make the earth happy, and the kingdom of God must have come to us. He continued, quotation, therefore we cannot take up arms against them, our enemies, without becoming unfaithful to him that is Christ. So we have seen there was never a unified Anabaptist response. Each generation was confronted with new contexts and circumstances and had to find its answers, just as we must today. Thank you for your attention.
A complicated story. We have some time for questions. We have two mics here at the aisles. Please come forward, introduce yourself, your name, and ask your question.
Hi there, thank you so much. My name is John Bhupalan. I appreciated your phrasing of winding paths, and my mind was going to the biblical phrase, making crooked paths straight. What I appreciated was it's winding paths, not necessarily crooked paths, right? It's very interesting kind of just processing for myself. I've been trying to figure out Mennonites and war, We're just trying to figure it out. I'm not a Mennonite, so I'm just trying to figure it out. So on the one hand, it seems to me that there's a certain kind of war that is waged by force without provocation, to use a word that I do not like, preemptive strike kind of war. And then there's this other kind of violence in which somebody attacks you and then you defend yourself. And I don't know, am I sensing that in the history of Mennonites, maybe some were okay with that latter kind of violence that is employed in the service of defense rather than offense? And if that is the case, is there any room to make a legitimate claim that Mennonites are anti-war with respect to the latter sense of violence?
I hope I understood it right now, but well, we can say you have various forms also of non-violence, because especially the Hutterites were the ones in the 16th century who really had some kind of the strictest form of the more strict form of non-violence, which meant not defend yourself. Yeah, so that this was the most strict form. Even if you are traveling and some robbers come, you have a stick that helps you to walk, but you are not allowed to use the stick to defend yourself. Yeah, so this is mainly the Hutterite example in the 16th century, and then you have the whole variety. Interestingly, Mennonites, there's a short passage in the Articles of Wismar in the 1550s, and Mennonites was among those who debated these articles, and one of the articles says that you are against war. I summarize a bit. They are against war, but it tends to that the answer is, but if you're a soldier, you are allowed to go to war as a Christian. It is very difficult to interpret the passage, because in German it's not quite clear what is meant. Yeah, but if he says, well, if you are a soldier and you become a Mennonite or a Christian, but he didn't say become a Mennonite because they were not Mennonites at that time. But if you become an Anabaptist, you are allowed to stay a soldier. Maybe it meant this. Yeah. So we have the whole variety of non-resistance, and then really the reflection what war means is later times. We don't have these reflections among the early Mennonites, yeah, and not among the early Anabaptists, but it was really also something. We Anabaptists don't go to war, but there is no play for we want the society to rethink war in the 16th century. Yeah, so we have this whole variety that makes it difficult. I mean, it is a difficult story. Yeah, to see the different forms of nonviolence and how it changes. And when you come to the 19th century, then it becomes more difficult even. Yeah.
Sheila Clausen-Wiebe, I teach Bible here. So as Mennonites became more open to use of military and arms and so on, I can see how my question's a Bible question, would embrace Romans 13, but what did they do with Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount? Did they just sort of set that aside, or Jesus' nonviolent death, like his giving up his life, or Matthew 5, which, love your enemy and don't resist the evil? I'm curious what they did with the Bible and Jesus.
That's a difficult question. I mean, some sort of argument you saw with a quotation from Leonard Weidmann from 1819, where it says where there are several demands or requests, but some requests concern the religious life, and some demands concern the civil life. And and we have to rethink the demands for civil life. Yeah, I can't tell you now how they, if Jesus is an argument in these. It's interesting. I have to look that up. So thank you for that question. How they really argue Jesus there. It is more that the argument. Well, we are open to society. We have to integrate into society. This is more stressed, yeah, at that time, and well, it's more, the argument is more the necessity. Well, then we have to do that, yeah. But thank you for that question. I'll look that up. Yeah. Do you have an answer?
Well. So Wilhelm Mannhardt, how is he related to Jakob Mannhardt? Is that
I think he's a brother.
Yeah. So he writes several articles in the Mennonitische Blätter between 1868 and 1870, I think, something like that. And it's probably in my mind, the strongest argument for a just war position by a Mennonite. And he is not Christological very much at all, I would say. He's much more pragmatic, and he argues like a Lutheran would about how you address the question of war and peace. I mean, that's where I would go for that theological argument.
What was the name of the guy?
Wilhelm Mannhardt, yeah.
He wrote a whole. The articles were then combined into a whole booklet, Die Wehrfreiheit der Mennoniten. That was a book. The Association of the German Mennonites asked him to write that, to have an argument in the whole question. I mean, it was in the 19th century. It was a very, very lively discussion among the German Mennonites, and he went back to the sources of the Anabaptists and tried to find a solution, how the Mennonites should argue in all their petitions and everything.
Thank you. You discussed how, in the face of rising militarism and potential conscription and such, some Mennonites emigrated from Germany. But you said something along the lines of a lot of Mennonites had become so integrated into German society and official positions that they found it much harder to leave. And I'm just wondering if you could say a little more about that, if there are any kind of anecdotes or studies done on that effect. I'm just interested in the split there between those who left and those who stayed.
Yeah, I mean, there are some tragic stories also combined to that, because when latest in 1868, it was clear that the solution was to have to take part in the army, but serve in in units that did not take up arms. And then, even then, some Mennonites tried to stick to non-resistance, and there's the example of one elder in Heubuden, that's in West Prussia, and he only baptized members of his congregation when they said they would not serve in the army. He tried that, but not long. That didn't work for a long time, and they had to migrate then. Yeah, that was one of the more public to issue their argument. Yeah, but the question was solved quite soon among the German Mennonites, because they all saw we are part of the society, and we just go with it, and then combined with also with fierce polemics. I mean, they were really part of the German nation in the second half of the 19th century, and you can read that also when the war, for example, the war against the French in 1870-71. when you open the journals like the Mennonitische Blätter or Gemeindeblatt that were published at that time, you have really, really strong polemic articles against the French. Yeah, where you see how this integration in the nation also had influenced the speech, yeah, and the hatred that is felt in these articles. So, and that was mainly the situation. And I'm not sure which Mannhardt. There's another Mannhardt who published a longer article during the First World War, and arguing why it is okay that pastors serve in the army. Yeah, well, that was the development.
I'm Don Peters. Thank you for your work. I'm hearing a correlation between integration in society and engagement in the military. That is, the greater the integration within the society, the greater the obligation for engagement in the military. I'm wondering if that is right, if that resonates, and if so, what that would say to us today. So that's my first question, and the second one is related. If I've heard you carefully this evening, you've taken us up to about 1938, and I'm wondering if somebody is sort of plumbing the record to see where the church is today on the same questions that you've been asking.
Well, it's always a question. I mean, it is right. The Mennonites, the more they were integrated into society, the more they were open to do military service. That started already in the 18th century, and then that what went on. What this means for us today, I mean, I'm always a bit hesitating to compare the times of the 19th century to us today. It is a different development, different situation. And I see more today, we are much integrated into society, but I think we have learned to issue our voice against some aspects of mainstream society. At least I can speak for Germany, where we had the last years a very intense discussion about giving wars to the Ukraine and everything. What does the war mean? And the German society was much pushed into promoting giving weapons to the Ukraine, and then it was the silent, the very still and small voice of the peace churches and the Mennonites that said, "Well, let's reconsider and be careful." So I think you can't draw the conclusion, the more the Mennonites are integrated in the society, the more they are open for military service. I think today it's the other way around. And I think it is good that this voice is issued, that there is some other opinion in the public than Zeitenwende, what we have, change of times, the popular word Zeitenwende, and then some say, well, let's see, it's difficult. There's more to that. Yeah, but I also see that it is a very difficult question in itself. I mean, although Mennonites have been the more hesitate against war today, we have the discussions in our congregations today. We are not one opinion in Germany. There are also the other voices, yeah. And then the challenge is how to integrate all the voices in the congregations. So that's also the challenge then.
We have to bring this to a close. I'm going to ask Paul Dirksen to come up at this time. Thank
Thank you. It's my pleasant task to just say a few thank yous before we dismiss. First of all, there's lots of people who make these kinds of things possible. Our hosting department, people who work with technology, and so on, and we're grateful for all those behind-the-scenes people. And then I also want to thank my fellow committee members, Carl Koop and Conrad Stace, a very pleasant group to work with as we organize these lectures. And then finally, if I can ask you to come back up, Astrid, please. I have a small gift for you. This is a much treasured CMU mug. You can either deliver lectures or work here for 10 years to get one. So I'm happy to give this to you. So, thank you. Thank you, and have a good evening.